Introducing Bonnie to you, Rabbi Bonnie Margulis is a founder of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, which is a wonderful statewide organization. One of the things I was thinking an action item could be is that we could all sign up for their email list, because Bonnie, I'm not on your email list, but I will be. So that's one wonderful organization. She is also a founder of the Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign, encouraging using faith as a way of encouraging people to vote. We're giving you 2 links to a couple of articles in the Wisconsin Examiner about warning Wisconsin people of faith about white Christian nationalism. Those are from the spring. And then Rabbi Bonnie Margulis, I'm just going to read this because it's so impressive. She's the founder and executive director of the Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, chair of the Wisconsin Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, as well as a member of the executive committee of the NAACP of Dane County, and a founder and steering committee member for the Dane Sanctuary Coalition, a founding board member of the We Are Many United Against Hate. Rabbi Margulis holds a master's degree in Judaic Studies from NYU, was ordained at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1992. She served as the director of clergy programming for the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice from 1996 to 2008. And in that capacity, the rabbi ran the Clergy for Choice Network, supervised the Religious Coalition's signature All Options Clergy Counseling Program, provided training for clergy in both All Options Clergy Counseling and Pastoral Counseling, reproductive losses, teaching others to provide trainings. She served as a member of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, Justice and Peace Committees, and is the past chair of the Women's Rabbinic Network Social Justice Committee. She served as a member of the J Street National Advisory Board for Field and Grassroots Organizing, and Rabbi Margulis is proud to have been a member of the Reformed Jewish Movement's Commission on Social Action, where she sat on the Women and Minorities Task Force. And she's taking some of her valuable time to talk to us tonight. And I'm going to stop my screen share and I'm going to welcome you, Bonnie. And you should be able to share your screen whenever you want. Oh, and she's joining the board of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. In her spare time, she'll be doing that.
Thank you so much, Deb. And thank you, Beverly, for putting that in the chat. Thank you all so much for inviting me to be here tonight to speak to you about a very important and somewhat scary topic. I will try not to scare you too much, but maybe just appropriately. As Deb said, Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice is a 501c3 nonpartisan statewide organization. We work through clergy and congregations and people of all faiths and people of no faith on a wide variety of social and economic justice issues, including workers' rights, voting rights, racial justice, LGBTQ justice, immigration, housing, healthcare, and building bridges between faith communities. My presentation tonight is going to lean very heavily on the work of Reverend Jennifer Butler from Faith and Public Life, Eric Ward, who is the executive director of an organization out of Oregon called the Western States Center, and also the work recently, a report that just came out from the Kairos Center and the Move On Education Fund. And I want to say that this work is very much a piece and part of an ongoing series of conversations and coalition work that Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice has been engaged in for over 2 years now, in partnership with the Wisconsin Council of Churches, the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee, Wisdom, Micah, the Wisconsin Council of Rabbis, the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, and others. And together we have weekly conversations that we call Creating Beloved Community, from a sermon from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And out of those conversations have grown a number of different projects and initiatives, primarily taking a faithful stand for equity and Teach the Truth Wisconsin. And last February, we brought Reverend Butler to Wisconsin for 3 days of a faith and democracy tour, where she spoke about the rise of white Christian nationalism. So I want to share my screen and share some slides with you all. And hopefully that worked. I hope that you can see it the way you're supposed to see it, because if I don't, oh, there it goes. Okay, great. So white Christian nationalism. First, what is it? What's the definition? Dr. Jamar Tisby said, Christian nationalism is an ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christian symbolism to create a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. As Reverend Butler has said, it's all about power, control, and wealth. And so notice in this definition by Dr. Tisby, it is not a religious movement. It is a social movement and a political movement and an economic movement. And it uses Christian language and Christian symbolism to give a veneer of Christianity to what is really at its core a movement around power, control, and wealth. The Cairo Center and the Move On Education Fund recently released a report, and they talked about the key ideological tenets of white Christian nationalism. So it is a mythology of American exceptionalism ordained by God. It is the belief that real Americans are descendants of white Europeans. It includes a veneration for the traditional family structure based on adherence to prescribed and rigid gender roles. It is a perpetuation of economic systems that maintain and reinforce economic dominance for a subset of white Christians, again, power, control, and wealth. It justifies the use of violence to protect and defend the nation from dangerous others. And it focuses on the erasure of the separation between church and state. And we have seen that recently in federal and Supreme Court cases where the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, the right of personal conscience and the right to practice our own faiths as we choose, has been privileged over the Establishment Clause. And really the Establishment Clause, what Thomas Jefferson called the wall of separation between church and state, has been more and more chipped away and eroded as part of this extremist agenda. So where does this come from? What is at the core and the foundation of white Christian nationalism? Eric Ward, as I said, he's the executive director of the Western States Center and a fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and he gives talks on the intersection between anti-Semitism, white Christian nationalism, and our work for an inclusive democracy. And he talks about how white Christian nationalism is really steeped in and framed around anti-Semitism. And it really traffics in the tropes and the beliefs and the ancient, really, understandings of what has been termed the world's oldest hate, which is anti-Semitism. And we see these elements from 2,000 years of anti-Semitism and Jew hatred being played out today in very dangerous ways. So some of the elements of anti-Semitism that Dr. Ward has identified and surfaced for us include things like the medieval blood libel. Today, we hear white Christian nationalists talk about QAnon and the QAnon conspiracy, and they talk about it in terms of Satanism and that people on the left are engaging in pedophilia and that we are endangering children and need to be stopped because of the danger to children. Well, this very much has its origins in what is known as the medieval blood libel. And the blood libel goes back to the early days of the Middle Ages, when Jewish communities were accused of killing Christian children in order to use their blood to make matzah at Passover time. Jews in the Middle Ages were accused of poisoning Christian wells, of causing the Black Death, of causing other plagues. And to this day, we see that played out in places like, for example, Racine and Kenosha, where flyers are circulated that claim that Jews are responsible for COVID. And why are Jews responsible for COVID? Well, because clearly Jews own the pharmaceutical industry and want to create a virus that will make millions of people sick so that Jews can then sell the vaccine and masks and other things that they will then be able to make a lot of money and control things through creating this virus. And so a direct line of descent from the medieval blood libel to QAnon to people claiming that Jews are responsible for COVID. Another piece that we have seen is this document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a forged document that was created in the early 20th century. And it claimed that a secret worldwide Jewish cabal, the Elders of Zion, had a secret conspiracy and were meeting on a regular basis in secret to plot the takeover of the world, the domination of the world. And these protocols purported to be minutes and notes and transcriptions from these secret international Jewish cabal meetings. And this was originally published in Russia in 1905, but it quickly spread throughout Europe. And it came to the United States under the auspices of no less a luminary than Henry Ford himself. And Henry Ford, in addition to being a leader in the auto industry, he basically owned the town of Dearborn, Michigan, and he owned the Dearborn newspaper. And that newspaper was read across the country. And he serialized in his newspaper the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. He was a rabid anti-Semite, and he was very delighted to be able to promote this scurrilous document that claimed this vast secret Jewish conspiracy. Now, lest you should think that this is now ancient history, just a couple of weeks ago, a woman in Florida tried to get Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem from President Biden's inauguration banned from her child's school library. And when reporters investigated this woman further, they discovered that she promoted and published the Protocols of the Elders of Zion on her social media. So this is not something that is ancient history. This is something that is very much with us and present today. The last piece that I want to lift up, although it's by no means the only things, is this replacement theory. The picture that you see behind the words is of white Christian nationalists in Charlottesville, Virginia, marching through the streets of Charlottesville, carrying tiki torches, and what they were chanting was, "The Jews will not replace us." So this was just a very graphic demonstration of replacement theory. And replacement theory says that there is this vast conspiracy to replace white Christians with Black people, with Latinx people, with immigrants, with LGBTQ people, with people who are not us, right? Not the white Christians. And why is it that the Jews are behind this? So, as Dr. Ward explains, in the worldview of white Christian nationalists, They believe that race is not, as we understand it, a social construct, but rather is an actual biological fact. And it is an actual biological fact that people with white skin are inherently biologically superior, and people with Black or brown skin are biologically, naturally inferior. Also, as we said, with these strict gender roles, women are naturally inferior to men. And because this is also very much steeped in biblical text and ideology, a very sort of narrow right-wing ideology, LGBTQ people are inherently evil and bad. And so when white Christian nationalists saw the success of the civil rights movement, of the women's liberation movement, of LGBTQ rights, it literally just does not compute in their brains. How could that be? How could Black people be gaining civil rights? How could they be tearing down Jim Crow laws? How could they be putting an end to segregation? How could women be rising in professions and graduating from colleges? How can LGBTQ people be gaining their rights? This does not compute because they are biologically inherently inferior. And so there must be something else going on, something behind the scenes. Well, what's behind the scenes? It's the Jews. The Jews who look white, who can pass for white, and are therefore very dangerous because they are not white, are able to be the puppet masters, and Blacks and women and LGBTQ people, these are the puppets. And it is the Jews who are conspiring to replace white Christians with Black people and brown people and putting women into positions of authority and economic success. Again, power, wealth, control. And so if we are going to reassert our dominance as white Christians, we must fight against the Jews who are bad and evil and conspiring and who are enabling Blacks and brown people and migrants and religious minorities and women and LGBTQ folks to succeed. So there have been a couple of different polls and surveys that have been done recently that show how these messages have really become pervasive in our society in many ways, in ways that we don't even really realize how much people are absorbing these messages without realizing where they come from and what they really mean. So the University of Maryland recently did a poll, and the question was, should the United States, or would you favor the United States declaring that the United States is a Christian nation? 61% of Republicans said, yes, we should declare that this is a Christian nation. 17% of Democrats agreed. And overall, 38% of Americans think, yes, we should declare the United States is a Christian nation. Similarly, the Public Religion Research Institute does an annual American Values Survey. Their last survey that they've published in 2021 asked, do you believe that being a Christian is somewhat or very important to being truly American? 63% of Republicans said, yes, in order to be truly American, you need to be Christian. 37% of independents said yes, in order to be truly American, you need to be Christian. And 35%, more than a third of Democrats, agreed with this statement that you must be Christian. That's very important, or at least somewhat important, to being truly American. Reverend Butler talks about what was the galvanizing incident that led to the most recent resurgence of white Christian nationalism? As Deb mentioned, this is not something that is new, something that has been in American history for a long time. Father Coughlin was just one of the most egregious examples. But what made it really rise to the top in the last 50 years? And as Reverend Butler points out, many people think that the galvanizing incident was the passage of Roe v. Wade. But in reality, that wasn't it. In reality, it was the end of Jim Crow and the end of segregation. And so one of the first things that happened in 1970, the IRS denied tax exemption to segregated academies, so to private sectarian schools that were formed specifically because of Brown versus Board of Education, specifically because public schools were being integrated. And there was a white flight away from public schools into creating private religious schools that were segregated and that were formed as nonprofits and claimed tax-exempt status. And the IRS said, no, if you are segregated, if you are discriminating, you cannot have tax-exempt status. Now, lest you should think that abortion is one of the cruxes of the rise of white Christian nationalism, the reality is the majority of Americans believed that abortion should be safe and legal, including what we would consider to be one of the most conservative religious denominations, the Southern Baptist Convention, which actually in 1971, so 2 years before Roe, adopted a pro-choice stand. In 1973, the Supreme Court handed down the Roe v. Wade decision, making abortion legal in the United States. But the next important thing that happened is in 1976, Bob Jones University, which was a segregated university, had its IRS status revoked and a fine levied against it. And as part of the backlash against that, in 1980, the next time that there was a presidential election, the Republican Party platform included a section that called on the IRS to end the policy of denying tax exemption to segregated institutions. And it's around this time that the Southern Baptist Convention takes a hard right turn away from abortion rights and to an anti-choice stand. After the Republican Party platform, Ronald Reagan gets elected president, and one of the first things he does is he fulfills a campaign promise, and his Treasury Department announces that it will no longer deny tax-exempt status to segregated institutions, especially schools. However, in 1983, the Supreme Court still followed through with the law, and Bob Jones University lost its case to get its tax-exempt status reinstated, and the court said, no, we have jurisdiction and we can revoke your tax-exempt status. In 1984, the Republican Party platform fully adopts a fully pro-life, or as I would say, anti-choice stand. So why is it that when we hear talk from the religious right and from white Christian nationalists, it's all about abortion rights and LGBTQ? Well, it's because it was not politically palatable. By this time, Jim Crow has ended, integration is fully underway, the civil rights movement has made gains, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act have both passed, and it is not politically or culturally viable to be upfront about your pro-segregationist stand. And so the religious right, the white Christian nationalist movements had to find something else to galvanize their base and to organize around. And so they latched on to abortion rights. And that's when the anti-choice movement really started to take off. And today, of course, as we know, has also added the assault on LGBTQ rights and the LGBTQ community. It's all, again, about power, control, and wealth. So what does this look like today? So today, as we know, there's been the backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement. There's been the demonization of the immigrant community. It did not start with Donald Trump, but he certainly took advantage of it, and he leaned into it, as we know, from the very first moment of his announcing his first presidential run in 2016. It was entirely steeped in and framed around anti-immigration rhetoric, that these brown people are coming to murder us, to rape us, to bring drugs. They are inherently dangerous and bad, and we should keep as many of them out of the country as possible. The assault on LGBTQ rights, which we are seeing today, the growing support for conversion therapy here in Wisconsin, an attempt to ban conversion therapy was overturned by our state legislature. Ongoing assaults on LGBTQ rights, including barring trans athletes in public schools from playing on the teams that reflect their gender identity, and bans on gender-affirming therapy, gender-affirming medical care. We've seen, as we all are all too familiar with, the attack on the Sikh community in Oak Park, the mass murder of Latinas at a Walmart in El Paso, the massacre of Black parishioners at Bible study in a traditionally Black church in South Carolina, the increase in anti-Semitism, including the attack and massacre of 11 Jews who were at Shabbat worship at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the attack on a congregation in Poway, California, an attack on a rabbi in his own home during Hanukkah celebrations in Muncie, New York, and the kidnapping and takeover of a rabbi and his congregants in Colleyville, Texas, in that 9 or 11-hour standoff. We've seen book bannings, particularly books that talk about LGBTQ families, or that depict brown and Black people, or that lift up the truths about our racist history. And of course, as you all know, we've seen widespread voter suppression and partisan gerrymandering. Going back to that first slide, that foundational tenet that violence is an appropriate response to defending white Christian nationalist rights and what they perceive to be their government. And we saw that most egregiously played out in the January 6th insurrection. And finally, or at least most recently, the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. So what's a Christian to do? So far be it from me as a Jew to tell you all what you should be doing. But as a Jew, I would like to call upon my Christian friends and allies to stand with the Jewish community and other communities that are facing threat from white Christian nationalism. And there are a lot of things that can be done. And first and foremost is speak up. Whenever you see white Christian nationalist messages, speak out. Counter messages of hate with messages of love. Counter anti-democratic messages with pro-democracy messages. Make it clear that your understanding of Christianity and your understanding of what Jesus taught and said is not in consonance with what people are hearing from white Christian nationalists, and is not your faith understanding of what your faith is about. Stand with the Sikh community, the Jewish community, the immigrant community, the Muslim community, the LGBTQ plus community, particularly when you see times when these communities are under threat. Stand up, speak out, show your solidarity with these communities. Speak at school board meetings when you hear about assaults on minority rights, when you hear about book bannings, when you hear that teachers are being stifled from teaching the truth of our racist history, when you hear that first grade teachers can't teach their kids to sing songs about rainbows, I hope that you will come out to those school board meetings and speak up and show your support for equity and inclusion in our schools and in our communities. Call your legislator, tell them that you don't want gender affirming care to be banned, that you believe that the LGBTQ community should have full equal rights and protections under the law, that you don't agree with book banning, that you believe that that our kids should be taught the full range of our histories and who we are as a people and how our nation came to be. Write letters to the editor, raise awareness, educate your community, let people know what you see is happening and what you agree with and what you disagree with. And again, countering messages of hate with messages of love. And finally, do what you're already doing so well and fight for fair maps and fight for voting rights. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and to share with you all.